Michael, thank you very much. And let me ask my fellow panelists to also come onto the stage, and I will introduce them shortly.
Thanks, John.
So look, as they take their seats, let me just do the roll call. I'm delighted that we've got Elizabeth and Mrema, the co-chair of TNFD, joining us virtually. And then in the room, Dr. Helen Crowley, who's the managing director of Pollination, and Beatriz Merino, director of the Nature Conservancy. So it's such a brilliant panel that my job is going to be very simple, and that's just to keep things on time. Last time I spoke in the Mansion House on climate change, I finished by saying there can be no net zero without nature. And that's maybe why they asked me to come back again to do this panel. But nature's not new. What got me hooked on sustainable finance 21 years ago was forests, was nature, was biodiversity. Climate, frankly, was of secondary importance. But climate has pushed nature into the slow lane as it's sort of accelerated away. And what we want to get out of this 25 minutes is how do we get it back into the fast lane and accelerate finance for nature? And that's the name of a report that PwC produced a couple of weeks ago, which I will draw upon. But we've got a lot going on. The Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed in Montreal, the TNFD, and Elizabeth will take us through that. And as if by magic, the science-based targets for nature released this morning to coincide with this conference. And I don't know who pulled those strings, but it wasn't me. But our report around accelerating nature puts some sort of rather grim numbers out there. 154 billion per annum for nature-based solutions. About 80% of that comes from government and donors. It's under a half of what we need by 2025 and under a third of what we need by 2030. And yet, and these are UNEP's numbers, and yet, the high-level champions for UN climate change say there's a $4.5 trillion opportunity for nature-based solutions. So if you're a financier or a project developer in nature, just focus on how do we get to $4.5 trillion, because that's what we really need. And then finally, for me, just some of the barriers that we highlighted, and there are four. The small size and high cost of transactions needs to be fixed. Risk versus return is out of kilter. We might touch on blended finance. Skills, not just of project developers in terms of commercial skills, but actually financiers in terms of understanding the projects they're being asked to finance. And then the biggie, data, 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 and how do we get better data? So look, that was just to sort of warm up the room a little bit. And what I wanted to do was really to ask each of the panelists one sort of very quick opening questions. I hopefully created a sense that there's a lot of momentum going on in nature, certainly since COP15. Just sort of a couple of sentences, Helen and then Beatriz and then Elizabeth, on what you're most excited about, and then the question, will it be on the agenda of COP28?
Great, thank you. Thrilled to be here and thrilled to be talking about biodiversity and nature in this week. We started with International Biodiversity Day. I'm an ecologist by training, so it's very dear to my heart. So yes, I'm excited about, as you said, the momentum. It's pretty phenomenal what's happened in the last 2 years, and I think it's important to understand that it is quite recent that there are so many new people at the table. We've been talking about for years, but there are new people at the table, and those new people are the financial community, and so it's very exciting to sort of move through from understanding risk to value and opportunity and actually implementing on that. Will nature be at the table? Absolutely. You've got to solve for both or solve for neither, as you mentioned, when it comes to climate and nature. It has to be there, but it has to be in a way that you can articulate what are we going to finance, how are we going to finance it, what are we going to do to bring climate and nature together in solutions, not just nature-based solutions, but solutions more broadly, and to articulate where there might be perceived trade-offs, how we mitigate any perceived trade-offs.
Great, thank you. Beatriz.
Yeah, indeed, I would agree with Helen, thank you. I work at the Nature Conservancy. I spent 20 years working in finance and banking before I joined TNC 3 years ago. And what I have seen over these 3 years is that an increased talk about nature finance, strategies on nature positive, not only from the private sector, corporates, financial institutions, but also from multilateral development institutions, central banks, and regulators. So definitely nature is there. I think we need to walk the talk now. What I'm very excited about is about the financial innovation that is happening in the sovereign debt capital markets space with debt for nature swaps. and sustainability-linked bond. And I'm looking forward to the French summit at the end of June to discuss the global financial architecture and how we can use better blended finance, and in particular the capital of multilateral development institutions, to bring more in a way that is more effective and more agile funding for climate and nature that can bring private sector investments to the table. And I think that blended finance will be one of the key topics at the agenda at the COP this year, so very much looking forward to it.
That's great, thank you. And Elizabeth, what excites you, and what do you want to see out of COP28?
Clearly, we have seen nature getting more able of the financial institutions. And this began so much since COP26. COP27, we even had a full day of biodiversity and finance, just the way we did in Montreal last year for COP15 of the CBD. And now nature is impacted by changes in climate, and loss of nature worsens our resilience to climate change. And yet nature is part of that solution for climate change. The two issues are linked. Delighted that linkage is now recognized, and we know already our host with nature as a focus issue during COP28, and we're already working with the host country together with the Secretariat in that regard. So nature is no longer a backdoor issue. It's very much on the table of all stakeholders, including financial institutions, investments, and the like.
I mean, that's great, Elizabeth, thank you, and I'm glad that all three panellists are talking with excitement around how the finance sector is really beginning to understand and embrace nature, because it's not a new issue. Elizabeth, staying with you, obviously your role co-chairing a TNFD gives you brilliant insight into the whole investment value chain. What do you think the finance sector needs to do most to sort of change its relationship with the natural world? And how can the TNFD really help them understand and or make better decisions around how they allocate capital?
One, I think they need to understand that TNFD is basically going to provide organizations with a framework to better understand, assess, report, and ultimately be able to disclose their exposure to nature-related risks, impacts, and dependencies. And this, by doing so, actually we expect organizations to begin to understand not only how they impact nature, but also how nature loss impacts them or impacts their operations. What we are seeing, for instance, is the effect of nature loss and climate change, both impacting business. Let's look at the loss of pollinator species or water resource shortages, wildfires, reduction in fish stocks, and etc. So literally, they need to understand their exposure. They need to understand their dependencies on nature within their value chain, be able to build the resilience as the result, and thus being able then to enhance benefits from the natural habitat. And this is what, not just from the TNFD part, but we see the new Global Biodiversity Framework, which was adopted in December, adopted a specific target, which in addition to expecting governments first to put regulations in place, but the target which asks transnational businesses, specifically in financial institutions, to assess and publicly on their nature-related disclosures, dependencies, and impact. And this is where then TNFD is already on the way to fill that gap and to respond to the implementation of this specific target. It's being market-led initiative supported by governments and multilateral bodies, and we hope it will be a framework of choice on nature-related financial disclosures. And this, of course, will be complemented, what we know financial institutions, organizations well know, with the climate financial-related disclosure. TNFD has built in within the recommendations already made for climate, to ensure that when companies report for climate, they can basically also report for nature without being seen as an add-on. So we need them to be on board. We need them to understand how and what they need to do, and the framework by the TNFD to be launched in September this year will be ready and there to support them in that regard.
Elizabeth, many good points there, but as we focus on delivery, 3 that really stood out for me. Number 1, get on board. So actually really think about how nature can pose risks and opportunities to you. Number 2, embrace a TNFD, pilot it, implement it when it's released. And number 3, the Global Biodiversity Framework gives you a really good framework for decision making and how you think about it. So if we're being practical and delivery focused, there, my summary of Elizabeth's many excellent points. Helen, you're also involved and have been involved for a long time. What are the sort of innovative things that you're beginning to see that are really going to scale up and deal with that sort of size and transaction cost problem?
Great, thanks. I like using the word replicate because nature replicates rather than scales, but that's a whole other discussion, but replicate to get to much bigger. The innovation, okay, let's start with the fact that this is pretty new for many. The idea that there is risk that hasn't been counted before, and that's why TNFD is really powerful to say there is risk that wasn't in your original risk return analysis. There is risk out there of business as usual is so risky now because the infrastructure upon which a lot of our investments, our entire economy is based, the natural infrastructure, the green infrastructure of the world is fraying and falling to bits. So this idea that it's risky to act for nature and to invest in nature, invest in natural climate solutions, nature-based solutions, that needs to be broadened to understand the risk of not doing it. So I think that's sort of a good basis to sort of think about it, because it is new. We've externalized all those impacts on nature, and we haven't really taken into consideration the dependencies on nature in finance and business until to date. And I used to work for Caring, the global luxury group that did the first environment profit and loss account and showed that 10 years ago, 711 million euros a year in impacts, cost to society for their business. The externalities of the business were that high, and they continue to, and you can see all the evolution of that. But the point there is that was all externalized. That now has to be internalized, and that's challenging. It's not an easy thing to do. But what we're seeing is there's starting to be opening up. Okay, I've got this risk. I can see my returns are going to be, I can understand now the opportunities of, for example, investing in agriculture in different ways, whether you call it regenerative, restorative. Can see that, food is to nature what energy is to climate. Transformation of the food sector, working on land, how we use land, how we do fisheries. That all has biodiversity outcomes. It has nature outcomes when in a positive and negative way, if you can do it. So how do you invest in that better? How do you enable that through supply chain investment, through traceability and tracking of data through supply chain? There's investment opportunities there. How can you finance some of that data collection and that innovation on the ground as you become a more regenerative farmer through biodiversity credits? As you showed, there's an uplift in biodiversity over those working lands or working seas. There's innovation in thinking about that as a new investment opportunity. There is innovation around infrastructure. I think it's one of the most exciting areas, and we heard from Philippe this morning from Pidge, is that there's a lot of thinking about how do you bring green and grey infrastructure together. How do you mitigate costs of maintaining grey infrastructure by using green infrastructure? Green infrastructure is nature. So there's a lot of innovation in thinking around sort of resilience, and in particularly resilience that green infrastructure provides, for example, coastal resilience for the insurance sector. So there's different types of money, different types of investment opportunities coming to play in this new sort of new space. It's been with us for 3 billion years, but you know what I'm saying, relatively new to most of us as an opportunity for investment and financial outcomes. So I'm seeing that in all different ways, different types of capital is coming in and different types of experimentation. So that if we start replicating that and testing it out more, we're really getting to the scale that we need to get to.
So what I'm hearing, again, just to add 2 more action points, is really making sure that financiers are in that dialogue with the customers they lend to, they invest in, they underwrite, to understand how nature affects their business and therefore how they can think about risk management, but also innovative products to get funding at scale into those areas. So it plays to that skills point, that you need skills. I wanted to ask a slightly personal question, if I may, and that is,
Depends what it is.
You've been working in this for a long time,
I have.
both on, in the luxury goods sector and now at Pollination. Do you stay positive all of the time?
Do I stay positive all the time? Yes, is the short answer. I guess I'm moving from optimism to hope at the moment, but I have been in this for 30 odd years, and I was on the front lines of conservation and development in Madagascar and Africa in the early part of my career. One of the reasons that I have moved to where I am is because I have a great deal of hope in finance and in the way that can pivot fast when value is perceived, when risk is understood, and when value and opportunity is perceived, it can move fast. And that gives me a great deal of hope. It hasn't, but we're positioning with TNFD, with everything else that we were talking about, we're positioning for that pivot. So that gives me hope. And the other thing that gives me hope is that we all underestimate the power of nature. And I joke about 3.2 billion years of R&D, but that's basically nature. I mean, living nature, biodiversity, and the interaction of all that has given us everything that we have in our society today, and so on, and we'll go on perhaps beyond this. But the power, we are measuring certain things, and I know we talk about data and we need to measure certain things. We're never going to measure everything. We have indicators that help us know we're on the right track. But what we don't realize is how powerful functional nature can be. So I think I have hope in that restorative, regenerative approaches that we're doing, there will be so many benefits that we can measure and count, and so many that we're only on the cusp of understanding how powerful they will be to sort of build back a functional and thriving world and society.
Great, thanks. So that brings me on rather neatly to you, Beatriz. So, we've said up front that climate change and biodiversity loss are absolutely linked. No net zero without nature. Are there things we can learn from the world of climate finance that we can apply to nature finance? And if you've got a couple of examples where it's worked well, or other solutions that we've found, it'd be really great to hear about them from your experience.
Yeah, actually, I think that the key lesson from climate finance is that we eventually have decided that we have to link it to nature finance as well, right? Because climate and nature come together, both biodiversity loss and climate crisis are exacerbating each other, and both working together can be part of the solution. And we can think about climate and the energy transition and deployment of renewables, where we have to be very, very aware where this siting of renewables happen, and to try to identify the sites that bring the minimum impact on people and the environment. Or when we talk about climate adaptation and building physical grey infrastructure, well, we have to take into account what nature can add to that by integrating natural infrastructure. As Helen was saying, the insurance of coral reefs or the insurance of mangroves. When we talk about water and food security and the impact of climate change on those ecosystems, we have to think about how we can work aligned with nature in order to preserve those ecosystems. And there are many examples in which nature-based solutions and using nature on regenerative agriculture or in the management of watersheds can help us to underpin the security of those ecoservices. And when it comes to climate mitigation and trying to reduce CO2, we know that natural climate solutions, the carbon sinks that forests and wetlands and many other ecosystems represent, they have the potential to capture 1/3 of the emissions that are needed by 2030 to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So I think that the main lesson of climate finance is that we have to add climate and nature finance together. Then I think that there are many other lessons that have to do with integrity, governance, transparency, the risk of greenwashing, in particular when you think about voluntary carbon credit markets and all the talk we are seeing now about maybe developing biodiversity credit markets, which I think that they are very different, but there are some lessons that one should take in mind with regards to integrity and transparency. And a couple of very quick examples from the Nature Conservancy of investment opportunities or transactions and scale would be the debt for nature swaps that we have been doing in the last couple of years, whereby we are helping governments to refinance their debt, outstanding debt obligations, and we do that by working with banks that place fixed income instruments with investors. Those fixed income instruments are created and enhanced with political risk insurance from development finance institutions or with guarantees from the same, and therefore they allow the refinancing of that debt at more affordable rates for the government. Usually they can deliver a decline in debt to GDP ratios, lower borrowing costs, but they always deliver savings that are going to be used by the government to try to deliver on the climate and biodiversity commitments for which it's so difficult to find funding. For example, we did the Belize transaction in 21, and we helped the government to refinance $500 million in an outstanding Eurobond that generated about $180 million for a period of over 20 years. To help the government to achieve their climate and biodiversity targets and to achieve 30% of marine conservation, which is so key for the functioning of their blue economy. And probably we did Barbados as well, in this case with a guarantee from the Inter-American Development Bank, a refinance of $150 million that is going to deliver the country $50 million over a period of 15 years again, for attending the needs that they need and to deliver on the KPIs that were included in the deal and were agreed by the government. And probably many of you saw the Ecuador debt refinancing transaction, which is the largest ever so far, 1.6 billion in refinancing that is going to generate for Ecuador more than 300 million over a period of almost 20 years. For marine conservation. And marine conservation means also many other measures and investments that are going to support the blue economy, are going to increase resilience, and are going to support the sustainability of these countries. Another example would be how we partner with large asset managers in trying to manage their assets to achieve the most impact when it comes to outcomes on climate, biodiversity, and also financial returns. The Nature Conservancy has an impact investment team, which is called Nature Bets, which actually what we do is to structure transactions that can deliver climate conservation, but also financial returns. And we were established in 2014. We have closed 15 deals, and we have about $3 billion in assets under advisement. The diversity of our transactions is very wide, small, large. Some of them, they produce impact investment type of returns, some of them preservation of capital only, and some of them are more aligned to the scale and the returns that more traditional investors are looking. In this context, we have a partnership with the Renewables Resource Group, RRG. They invest in land, water, and renewable energy assets, and TNC has inserted in the structure of the Sustainable Impact Water Fund, which has about 900 million of assets under management, as technical advisor. So what we do is to establish the minimum standards that that fund has to deliver in terms of conservation, climate, biodiversity outcomes, and we also analyze project by project and deal by deal that gets into the pipeline, where is the maximum impact that in terms of biodiversity and climate that particular asset can achieve. The idea is to show, and of course we do that always in alignment with the fiduciary duty of the asset manager. The idea would be to show to other asset managers in the similar space, best practice when it comes to manage natural capital assets in a way that it can maximize outcomes that we are looking for, but also financial returns.
Look, some really great examples and points there, from the three panelists. The countdown clock is telling me I have virtually no time left, but one final question with a one-sentence answer, and I'm going to come to you last, Elizabeth, because you're going to have the last word. But Helen and Beatriz and then Elizabeth, what is the one thing you want people in this room and online to take away that they can practically do today?
The one thing is to look at TNFD and understand your risks and find your value in avoiding impact, your first, and then restoring and protecting nature.
Thank you. Beatriz.
Similar to, but if they have to do today, similar to go to the TNFD website and have a look at the 11 core metrics which TNFD has is thinking to apply to assess the risks and impacts. They are about land use change, pollution, and the use of natural resources. And just give it a thought today about how you think those can impact your businesses. I think that will help you to demystify the perceived complexity of understanding nature in a business context.
Great. And Elizabeth, you get the final word. What's the one thing you would like the people in the room and online to do today?
To join the over 200 companies which are already testing the TNFD, because only by beginning to doing it, testing it, then they will be able to really better understand, better build that capability, and really be able then to assess the risks and impacts. So as the previous speakers have indicated, please join us through the website, join us to pilot test the framework, and share your comments and inputs as we move forward.
That's great, thank you. So look, with 200 people in the room and 2,000 online, that's 2,200 actions happening in the next 7 days, and you can think beyond the brief that you've had here. The final thing that I'm just going to mention is that we're really pleased to be working with the City of London Corporation. We've produced our own report looking at how one scales natural capital. There's a report looking at how London can be the natural capital when it comes to nature finance. And so, in the next 4 to 6 weeks, that report will come out. So my action is pick it up and read it and bring it to life. Final thing I'd like to ask you to do is applause for a brilliant panel that made my job so easy. Okay.